This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today's show is about women and markets. On the first half of the show, we'll discuss the gender pay gap in the United States. Why do women make less money than men? How much of this pay gap is discrimination responsible for? How much stems from different choices made by men and women in the labor market? Then, on the second half of the show, we'll turn to the international realm. How different are the economic freedoms of women and men around the globe? In which countries do women have the fewest economic freedoms? How does greater economic freedom impact the success women are able to achieve in labor markets and other indicators of well-being? My first guest is Dr. Peter Calcagno. Dr. Calcagno is a professor of economics and the director of the Center for Public Choice and the Market Process at the College of Charleston. Pete, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate being here.
So let's start with the gender pay gap. So everybody knows that this is the difference in pay earned by women and men, and we hear stats about it. What's the kind of status of it in the United States today?
So the last average of the 2017 National Labor Board was that it's about 80% of women and men. So that means that women are making about 80 to 82 cents approximately is what the stat is per dollar of men.
Per dollar of men. And what's it been over time? Because we can track this back to the 50, post-World War II years as women were entering the labor force. Has it always been like this?
No. In fact, it's grown a lot. So if you go back into the 1960s and the 1970s where we really started to look at this, right, it was as much as 56 cents or so on the dollar, right? So it's grown and it was a lot larger and it's now shrunk, right? So over time, the 80s in particular was an area in which we saw a lot of decline, the 90s as well. Since about 2000, early 2000s, it's sort of plateaued and it's roughly staying around in that 80% mark.
So for a roughly 40, 50 year period, we saw a big narrowing of the gap, and now we've kind of going from like almost half as much of men to 80% or so and kind of there. What's the big cause of this? So a lot of people, when they hear the gender pay gap report and they say, oh, it must be sexism or discrimination. That's not all that's going on here. What's this big change happening?
Well, a lot of it originally was due to differences in experience and education, right? So women weren't seeking the educational opportunities that men were, and so there was gaps in human capital, right? So women weren't pursuing professions that required, say, higher education degrees or very specific degrees, and that's changed a lot, right? So women have actually closed the gap with respect to their skills, both in terms of their experiences that they're getting and the degrees that they're seeking, right? In fact, not just college education, but pursuing greater degrees than that. And so that gap has really closed a lot, and that's a lot of the reason why the gap has closed.
Yet still some of it persists, this 80% part, although as college professors and economists, it strikes me when I look at my econ majors, it tends to be disproportionately male. And this is probably true in physics and some of the other hard sciences. Is there kind of a relationship there that's not accounted for in the explaining of the gap that might be part of this too?
Yeah, there's been a lot that's shown that a lot of this has to do with preferences of individuals, right? So what types of occupations are there going to be that women would prefer, say, over to men for a variety of reasons? You have aspects of it with respect to women wanting more flexibility to be able to step out of their job if they want to have children, right? There's also issues of time and commitment, right? So jobs that require a lot of hours and a lot of time and face time and so forth that don't provide a lot of flexibility haven't been occupations that women have necessarily chosen. So think about someone who's a partner in a law firm, right, who has to work 80 hours a week and needs to be there a lot of face time and so forth. That may not be what a woman chooses, right? Whereas other occupations don't require that and a lot more flexibility, you get the gap a lot smaller.
Yeah, or it means on average, not as many women choose that aspect. They choose a different part of
exactly.
law or something like that. It strikes me that this career choice part of it might be even more important at lower skill, or lower, not skill, but educational level occupations too, right?
Well, again, historically, one of the problems that you've seen, or one of the issues that's been pointed out, is that women gravitated to certain occupations, right? So teaching, nursing, and so forth, and they've been female dominated, and there again, the gap is really, really low. And this has been a contention of people that, okay, well, within the industries we get small gaps, but they're not choosing to go into other areas where they might see higher pay. But again, I think a lot of it's been shown to be due to preference, and some of those gaps are closing because of gains in human capital.
Sure. And it seems like some of them would still persist. I mean, I think of commercial fishermen or highway crew paving, things like that that are on the lower skill end tend to be disproportionately chosen by males. Is this discrimination, or is this just difference in that type of work preferences?
It's got to be, I would say, more related to work preferences, right? I think, you get paid well for, as Adam Smith would say, the disagreeableness of the environment, right? And, a lot of women and probably a lot of men, right? I don't necessarily want to be a commercial fisherman and go out and do that, right? So I wouldn't choose to be in that profession. And I imagine that's what's going on here with a lot of women choosing not to go into areas that are going to be maybe physically demanding or disagreeable in other ways.
So we can adjust for educational differences, which occupations that people go into. What are some of the other factors that would, other than discrimination, that would explain why a pay gap persists?
Well, again, I think it's going to be about skill and experience. Women also have had a tendency to leave the labor force, again, to go have children. And so what happens is that early on, if you look at men and women and when they first start their careers, the gap tends to be really, really small if you compare within even occupation, right? And over time, that gap can get bigger because women may exit the labor force, stay home with their children for a while, and then come back. And so now what you have is that male has stayed in the workforce that entire time, gained experience, gained pay increases, and that woman then comes back and has to make up for that time that she was out of the office. And so there's a lot of it has to do with exiting and entering the workforce.
So when we hear these 80 cents on the dollar thing that people talk about, that's really not comparing apples to apples then?
It's at best comparing full-time national averages, right? So that's across industries and not even looking within industries.
Right. It seems to me then, that instead of going across everything, if we were looking for discrimination, we'd be better off narrowing it down, wouldn't we, and looking within industries?
Yes. And Claudia Golden, the economist at Harvard, who does a lot of research on this, says that this is where the focus should be, that this is what still concerns her is within industry gaps, right? And to the extent that they still exist, again, she thinks of it as because of the labor market's not maybe providing the amount of flexibility that women would prefer.
So let's broaden this out just a little bit in the causes of this and the role of discrimination or sexism. How does a marketplace punish or reward or cope with things like this?
So in markets, firms have to pay a premium, if you will, for discriminating. If I'm willing to hire a male over a female who's not as good of a worker or maybe has less skills, then I'm going to pay for that in the sense of the productivity and so forth, for paying that higher wage to that male relative to that woman and the productivity I'm going to get. And if you're willing to pay that premium, so be it, but then that's going to show up in terms of your bottom line, and it's going to show up in terms of your competition, right? So the market punishes people who are willing to pay to discriminate, right, and willing to pay that premium to discriminate. And so in that sense, right, markets have a tendency to not want to. No one wants to go out of business because they were discriminatory. No one wants to see their profits fall because of being discriminatory.
Right, so there's a kind of inbuilt mechanism in the market that, well, won't necessarily eliminate it, it's at least going to minimize it and push it in that direction. So then the question comes up of what's needed for laws, because we've got 50 years of history of passing laws against discrimination in the workplace on many margins, but gender being one of them. What are the laws that Congress has passed on this, and what's their effect? So
Congress has passed, probably about a half a dozen at least major laws since the 1960s. So it started with 1963 in the Equal Pay Act. Civil Rights Act also addressed discrimination issues. Most recently, President Obama in 2009 had the Lilly Ledbetter Equal Pay Act. And all of these are supposed to ensure that individuals within occupation, right, are getting paid the same. And yet, what we're seeing is that when you do look within occupation, yeah, some of those gaps are very, very small. but they've gotten smaller over time, and not necessarily because of the legislation. If that was the case, right, the gaps decreased a lot well before President Obama ever passed the 2009 Act. So human capital in that education and the experience, and I think society encouraging women to be in the labor force, waiting to get married, waiting, to have children and pursuing careers, has done a lot more to explain, I think, this decline in the wage gap than any of the legislation.
Particularly when we start looking at the legislators themselves, as some of your work has looked at recently, do they put their money where their mouth is? i.e., is there a pay gap among the staffers who work for the legislators who pass these laws?
So I have a recent paper where we looked at both the House and the Senate congressional staffers across both parties and across both chambers, and we find that on average Congress is actually about the same, if not a little bit worse than the national average. Now, we can take that either with a grain of salt based on the data that we have, but we can also suggest that that's against the national average. And if we think of Congress as being within an industry, there's a pay gap there that can't be explained, right? It's higher, the unexplained portion of this, right, once you account for experience and education, is greater than what you see in the private sector. So they're not being consistent. And if we think about James Buchanan in Public Choice and wanting to compare across institutions, the public sector is not exactly solving this problem any better than the private sector is.
Which makes me question, is this, when I see 50% to 50 cents on the dollar versus, that seems really big. Once we're up to 80+%, is it actually a problem, or is maybe most of the discrimination already minimized and the residual is just unobserved preferences that we can't tease out of the data, if the very people who are passing these laws have that same gap in their own pay structure?
Well, and that's, again, if you go back to Claudia Golden's research, that's sort of what she suggests, right? That where we are right now is really a question of labor markets changing. And she thinks that government doesn't need to intervene, right? That rather what we need is for employers to recognize that people do have these differences and preferences and provide greater flexibility to get greater productivity out of their employees. So she notes that in, say, the pharmaceutical and tech industries, right, they are what she refers to as more linear, so putting in more face time and hours, and there's more flexibility. Pay is the same across men and women, and you can have the time to go home and check in on the family. But if you go to something like an environment where there's a lot of time need to be logged, that's where you see the differences. And if those industries would start to provide flexibility, she thinks most of that gap what's left will go away.
All right, well, thank you for discussing this with me today. Up next, we'll take a look around the globe and see how women's economic freedom differs from men's and why it matters. Stick around.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeVitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes, the Helen Jones Foundation. Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Rosemarie Fike. Dr. Fike is an instructor of economics at Texas Christian University and has conducted research on gender and economic freedom. Rosie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start, before we get into the gender part, we've done a lot of episodes of this show involving economic freedom before, and sometimes with some of the authors of the index, but it might be useful just broadly, without gender differences, first, what is economic freedom and how do we measure it around the globe?
So economic freedom is really the ability for individuals to kind of choose their own path in life, to make trades with people who they want to make trades with, to open businesses, to choose their own occupation. And so the way we measure it, we look at...
So basically just freedom for voluntary interactions in the economic sphere by consenting adults.
Absolutely.
Main kind of categories of how it's measured?
So there's 5 categories. There's the size of government relative to GDP, so kind of capturing how high the tax rates are going to be, so that's kind of a reduction in your property rights.
Okay.
The rule of law and how strong actual property rights are, how equally people are treated under the law, and that's what becomes relevant for the gender differences. We also look at regulation of businesses. So are there a lot of labor regulations, a lot of restrictions into the kinds of work that you can do? We look at the ability for people to freely trade internationally and the soundness of monetary policy.
All right, so let's dig into the property rights component then, because that's where we start to see the differences in what your research is getting at. How is it, as we look around the globe, that economic freedoms of women differ from men?
Yeah, so what I've done is recognize the fact that women in a lot of countries don't have the same economic freedom. They don't have the same access to property rights. So a lot of countries in, the extreme cases would be countries in Middle East and North Africa where women can't really own or inherit property in the same way. They can't enter into a business contract. They can't even open a bank account without perhaps the permission of a male relative. They can't choose where to move, right, or about the country or outside of the country without somebody else's permission. And so those types of things really limit a woman's ability to actively participate in the market and to benefit from capitalism in the same way as their male counterparts do.
And some of these countries are actually otherwise fairly highly capitalist.
Oh, very fair. So the United Arab Emirates would be one that comes to mind. Prior to the gender adjustment to economic freedom, it has ranked in the top 20 most economically free countries in the world. And then after making a gender adjustment to account for the fact that 50% of the population doesn't have economic freedom, they drop 22 positions in the rankings.
Yeah, and I bet, I know you don't measure it back then, but if we think of early United States as being highly capitalist, some of these same type of issues would apply, right?
Absolutely. Women were treated as property under the law until towards the end of the 1800s. Even as late as the 1980s, women needed the permission of their husband in the United States to get a credit card. So these things have changed slowly, but they've changed significantly.
So what are some of the other international differences that we see in freedom of women and men?
So there's a lot of countries that have gender-specific labor regulation. So there's 104 countries in the world that have at least one regulation that forbids women from doing certain occupations that may be deemed unsafe or physically strenuous, or from working the same evening hours that men are allowed to work. So, for example, in Belarus, women are not allowed to work with pesticides. So if you were a woman living there and your best economic opportunity is to perhaps, work at a pest control company or something along those lines, that opportunity is completely cut out.
That's a really interesting point, because in the first half of the show, we talked about gender inequality in pay, mostly in the context of the United States, and part of it being based on selection of occupations. But what you're saying, as you look internationally, sometimes women don't have the freedom to enter hazardous but often high-paying relative to skill occupations.
Absolutely. One of the comments I often get from students when I talk about gender issues is, well, men take on these really dangerous jobs. And I have to bring up the fact that in a lot of countries, women aren't even allowed to consider these dangerous jobs, like mining and things like that.
So this actually leads nicely into looking at then how, as women have more economic freedom, how does it change their lives? How does it differ, I guess most directly then, in their economic outcomes when they have greater freedom to do these things?
So if we look at labor participation rates for women who live in economically free countries, they're about 45%, slightly less than 45%. But if you look at countries that are not economically free, their labor force participation rates are about half that, about 23%. So
about 1 out of 2 women working versus 1 out of 4 women working is labor market participation.
Yes. Yes, and fewer women are working in what would be considered vulnerable occupations, ones that don't have formal contracts, ones that tend to be very susceptible to economic fluctuations. About 13% of women are working in those in economically free countries, and it's far higher in economically unfree countries.
This probably translates into differences in incomes too, or other things like that?
I haven't quite explored that in my research, but there is a strong correlation between economic freedom and per capita income that has been established in lots of other research.
But you have looked at kind of financial outcomes for women, though, if not directly wages, but
Yeah,
other measures of that?
I've looked at access to financial institutions. So women in economically free countries, over 80% of them have their own bank account or their own account at some financial institution, whereas fewer than 25% of women in economically unfree countries have a bank account. So if we think about how this might matter for a woman's life, say you find yourself in kind of an unsafe household situation and you live in one of these countries where you need your husband's permission to work, you can't move freely about the country, and you can't open a bank account without your husband's permission. It's very hard to have an escape option. But if you're living in an economically free country and you find yourself in that situation, you can get a job. You can maybe open up a bank account that is a secret bank account that you don't know, that your husband doesn't know about, and you can start making plans to have an exit option. So I look at economic freedom as being a way for women to maybe escape a really bad situation if they need to.
Or just to equalize the bargaining power of both parties to a contract, a marriage contract.
Right.
This must translate into other sort of outcomes for women too, then, in terms of their health and things like that?
Yeah, women who live in economically free countries will live about 17 years longer than women who live in economically unfree countries. So that's a very real difference in life expectancy.
Now, in general, we find freer countries live longer too. Is it even more pronounced for women, or is this matching kind of the trend that you see?
It fits the trend that we would see overall, but it's still this economic freedom still has significant benefits for life expectancy. Women have better access to healthcare in economically free countries, so there are far few maternal mortalities when you're so about 400 deaths per every 100,000 births occur in economically unfree countries, and in economically free countries, it's fewer than 40. So it's huge, significant differences in these.
That's unique to women rather than the general relationship.
Yes.
Yeah. So education too, then, I imagine?
Absolutely. So just think about it intuitively. If you don't have economic freedom, why would you invest a lot of time and other resources into building your education if you can't use that education in the job market? So if we look at kind of crude measures of education like literacy rates, in economically free countries, about 98% of youth women are literate. About 93% of adult women are literate. And if you look at economically unfree countries, for youth, it's only about 72%. And for adults, it's about 49%. And so those are significant differences in even the most basic kind of human capital.
Yeah. So let's get to your adjustment then and talk about the countries where women are more free and less free than in light of these outcomes. So you've created this index that adjusts overall economic freedom to account for the fact that 50% of the population doesn't enjoy the same things. Who are the biggest losers? What are the countries that otherwise, we mentioned UAE, otherwise look pretty free, but once you account for the fact that the general laws don't apply to half people, really drop?
So the countries that have the most significant downward adjustment are Middle Eastern and North African countries. So Qatar drops about 23 positions in the rankings. Jordan drops significantly in the rankings, but there are some Southeast Asian countries too. Malaysia drops pretty significantly, about 17 positions relative to other countries. So those are broadly speaking, the countries that have significant decreases.
Now, are there any countries that we see that have big significant increases?
No, there's not. There are countries that do see some slight increases, but that's because other countries that were close to them in the rankings have been adjusted downward. So the upward mobility isn't that significant because what my gender adjustment does, it doesn't increase anybody's score. It's just knocking you if you are not giving equal access to economic freedom.
Right, because conceptually what you're not finding, women have actually even more economic freedoms than average in this country. They have the economic freedoms of average or less than.
Right. So the best a country could do is have no change in their score as a result of this adjustment. And there are 48 countries in the world that there's no change to their score. But it doesn't mean that people are free there. It just means there's equal treatment under the law. So
everybody's unfree in North Korea.
well, in Venezuela, that would be our good example, that men and women are equally unfree.
So last few seconds here, then let's bring it home to the United States. When you do this with the United States, is there any adjustment there, or how does it affect us?
So all of North America basically has no, at least in terms of how the law is written, there's no differences between how men and women are treated under the law or our labor regulations. So there's no change to the score for the US or Canada or Mexico.
At least as you're able to measure it across these indexes.
Right. No, that's not to say that, social norms might not play a role, but if we're just measuring how the law treats men and women, we're treated equally here.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
On the first half of today's show, we talked about pay differences in the United States between men and women, and how a lot of these differences stem from different choices made in labor markets between men and women's, rather than any sort of overt discrimination. But yet on the second half of the show, we talked about how the economic freedom of women differs substantially from men around the globe, and actually throughout our history too. And that these differences in economic freedom hold women back on numerous margins when they don't have economic freedom, how they're less prosperous, less healthy, less educated, and how more freedom promotes these things. I think a better path forward than increasing regulations is to grant women and men equal freedom and then respect the voluntary choices made by everybody in the labor market, regardless of gender. See you next time.